You're stopped behind lowered gates at a crossing, the red lights already flashing, and before the train itself ever comes into view, you hear it. Two long blasts, a short one, then one more long blast, the exact same pattern you heard at a different crossing last week, in a different town, on a different railroad entirely. It sounds almost casual, the way a familiar song does, but nothing about it happens by accident. Every locomotive engineer in North America, freight or passenger, rural or downtown, plays that same four-part sequence at that same kind of crossing every single time on lines that otherwise share almost nothing with each other. So who actually decided this was the pattern, and why, after nearly 2 centuries of trains getting faster and louder and far more advanced, has it never really changed? Let's get into it right here on Small Things. Where roads meet rails. A grade crossing is the technical term for any spot where a road and a railroad meet at the same level, no bridge or underpass lifting one above the other, just asphalt running directly across steel rail. Some amount to little more than a pair of tracks crossing a quiet country road beneath a single reflective crossbuck. Others carry multiple tracks through the middle of busy cities, surrounded by flashing lights, ringing bells, lowered gates, and electronic sensors quietly monitoring the rails long before a train ever appears. The locomotive horn belongs to that same warning system, but unlike every sign, light, and gate fixed beside the crossing itself, it approaches with the train, arriving only moments before the locomotive does. A cart full of butter and eggs. It did not begin with a rule book. It began with a cart full of butter and eggs. In May of 1833, a locomotive called Samson on the Leicester and Swannington Railway in central England struck a horse-drawn cart at a level crossing near Thornton. The driver had blown a hand horn to warn the cart off. It hadn't been loud enough. Nobody was killed, but the railway's manager proposed a fix, and George Stephenson, the engineer behind the line's locomotives, approved it. A local instrument maker in Leicester built a steam-powered horn, mounted it to the boiler, and within a few years, railways across Britain and then America had adopted some version of it. What nobody agreed on was what to actually say with it. Different railroads wrote their own signal codes, and engineers often layered personal style on top, using the whistle to announce themselves to neighbors as much as to warn of danger. A single long blast might mean one thing on one line and something else entirely on the next. As American track mileage multiplied through the 1800s, so did the number of places roads crossed rails, and railroads began writing formal crossing signals into their rule books. Long, short, short, long became common, echoing the shape of an X already painted on crossing signs. Railroads later found reason to stretch that first short blast into a second long one instead, and the sequence shifted for good. By 1938, the Association of American Railroads formally adopted the revised pattern, 2 long, 1 short, 1 long, as the standard. It remains to this day the exact sequence federal law requires. That change happens to line up with something else. In international Morse code, 2 long signals followed by 1 short and 1 long spells the letter Q, and a popular story claims that isn't a coincidence. Ships supposedly once sounded Q on their horns to signal Queen Victoria's vessel had the right of way in harbor, a courtesy that followed her onto the railways and eventually crossed the Atlantic. It's a good story, and almost certainly not a true one. The pattern used before 1938 spelled X, not Q, and the shift only happened afterward for acoustic reasons that had nothing to do with royalty. With only 2 kinds of blast to work with, arranged 4 at a time, nearly any sequence a railroad landed on was always going to spell something. This one just happened to spell a letter with a legend already attached. Why this shape works. So why does that specific arrangement actually work better than any of the other patterns railroads tried along the way before finally settling on this one? Two long blasts at the start do something a single blast never could. They stretch out the very beginning of the warning, giving a driver or a pedestrian more time to register that something is happening before they even have to identify what it is or where it's coming from. A short blast breaks that opening pattern, signaling that the sequence is shifting rather than simply continuing on. The way a pause in speech tells you a sentence is turning somewhere new. The final long blast closes the sequence out, confirmed and unmistakable, time to end right around the moment the locomotive actually reaches the crossing itself. That timing isn't left to guesswork either. Roughly a quarter mile before most public crossings, a small trackside marker, usually a post with a single letter W on it, tells the engineer exactly where to begin the sequence. The horn is required to start between 15 and 20 seconds before the train arrives at the crossing. Longer still if the train is moving fast enough that 15 seconds wouldn't give a driver enough room to react and clear the tracks in time. Nothing about the exact length of each individual blast is specified anywhere in the rule. That part is left entirely to the engineer's own judgment, which is why the same four-part pattern can sound clipped and businesslike, coming from one locomotive and drawn out almost musically from the next, without ever once changing its underlying shape. Think of it the way a lighthouse uses a specific flash pattern instead of one steady beam. A steady light blends into the background of everything else out there on the water. A pattern, repeated exactly the same way every single time, is what a tired brain half a mile away can recognize instantly without needing to consciously stop and think about what it's actually hearing. What Florida proved. It would be reasonable to assume that once a crossing already has flashing lights, ringing bells, and gates coming down across the road, the horn itself becomes somewhat redundant, one more layer of warning stacked onto several that already do the job on their own. Florida tested that exact assumption in the real world at scale over several years, and the results were not close. In 1984, the Florida legislature let local governments ban nighttime train horns at crossings that already had gates and lights installed. 7 counties and 12 cities took the offer, eventually covering 511 crossings along the Florida East Coast Railway. Everything else at those crossings stayed exactly the same. Gates still lowered, lights still flashed. Only the horn went silent between 10 at night and 6 in the morning. Federal investigators later compared nighttime accident rates at those 511 crossings before and after the bans took effect. Nighttime collisions had increased by 195%, nearly tripling, while daytime accidents at the same crossings, where the horn was still sounding, barely moved at all during the same stretch of years. In July of 1991, federal regulators ordered horns turned back on at every banned crossing in Florida. Nighttime accidents dropped 68.6% almost immediately, back down near where they'd started before the bans ever went into effect. Gates and lights alone, it turned out, had never been enough on their own. The sound itself was doing real work. The lights and the gates simply could not. People who live with the sound. An engineer on a late freight run passes a whistle post for what might be the 40th time that shift and begins the sequence without consciously deciding to. The way a driver signals before a turn they've made 1,000 times before without ever thinking through the steps. Too long, a short, a long. He's already checking the crossing ahead for anything moving before the last note has even finished fading into the dark behind him. In a town that fought for and won a quiet zone a few years back, a woman lies awake the first few nights afterward, unsettled by an absence she can't quite name, before finally realizing it's the missing horn she has always heard pass through around midnight. Eventually, she stops noticing the silence too, the way you eventually stop noticing any sound that used to wake you and now simply doesn't. It becomes just another feature of the town, one that arrived without anyone specifically announcing it, had changed. A track worker crouches beside the rail well after dark, checking a fastening by flashlight, close enough to the line that any approaching train is required to sound its horn specifically for her, regardless of whether she happens to be standing at a marked crossing or not. She doesn't look up every single time she hears one coming in the distance, but she always knows, without needing to check, exactly how far away it still is. Never allowed to change. The next time that four-part pattern drifts across a crossing near you, it's worth remembering it was never designed to be pleasant, and nobody was ever trying to make it one. It was built, argued over, tested, and revised for nearly 2 centuries by people who mostly never met each other and were separated by generations, each one responding to whatever the last version had failed to prevent. Every attempt to soften it, shorten it, or quiet it down for the sake of the people living nearby has eventually run into the same hard fact. Somebody, somewhere, found out exactly what the silence cost, and the pattern got put back exactly the way it was. That is the entire reason it has never really been allowed to change. If this changed the way you hear the next train horn near you, let us know in the comments what you want us to explore next. We might make it our next episode. Thanks for watching. History often hides in the smallest details.